In this module, we'll begin our study of Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway. We've already read one of Woolf's essays when we started Joyce's Portrait. Many of my students have preferred Mrs. Dalloway to Portrait because, unlike in Portrait, we are not locked into one consciousness throughout the novel. Even Joyce grew tired of Stephen Dedalus, so it makes perfect sense that readers might too. In Mrs. Dalloway, we have a wider variety of consciousnesses to inhabit. Mrs. Dalloway dates from about 10 years after Portrait. Unlike Portrait, which was set in the past and gradually came closer to the present day of its writing, though the action of the book ends in 1903 and the book itself did not appear until 1914, Mrs. Dalloway is set absolutely in the current day, June 1924, a time that Clarissa Dalloway describes by saying, "The war was over." Clearly, by 1924, the war had been over for a while, but its effects lingered. Mrs. Dalloway is set in Westminster, a city inside Greater London that is at the heart of the British political, spiritual, and social power. In the image you're looking at now, you can see the buildings where the British Parliament meets, with a tall clock tower, inside which is Big Ben, a bell whose name is often attributed to the clock and even to its tower. Look in the background between the clock tower and the two shorter towers of the Parliament building. Those two stubby white towers are part of Westminster Abbey. In the foreground is Westminster Bridge, crossing the River Thames. In this map of Westminster, you can see a tower marking the location of Big Ben. To the left of it are three parks, St. James's Park, Green Park, and Hyde Park. Just where St. James's Park joins Green Park sits Buckingham Palace, where the British monarch lives. If you traveled north from Big Ben along the wide road you see, you would encounter many official buildings. The city of Westminster itself was an expensive and exclusive address when Woolf wrote this novel, and is even more so now. In the novel, the characters move around in and near the city of Westminster, but they also think about other places, such as Burton, where Clarissa grew up, Italy, where Septimus fought in the war, or India, where Peter has been working for many years. Westminster is very centrally located in London, so it's easy to get to all the places you might want to go. So we could sum up and say that the novel is set in the very middle of Britain's seat of power. The Houses of Parliament, where the legislature meets, is there. The main area for the civil service is there, in Whitehall, things like the Ministry of Defense and the Home Office. The monarchy has not just Buckingham Palace, but the Palace of St. James, an ancient palace that is the official home of the monarch. The head of the Church of England, the monarch, resides close to one of the most important churches in Britain, Westminster Abbey. And of course, wealthy and powerful people, including but not limited to members of Parliament like Richard Dalloway, live there. The Prime Minister's residence is around the corner. The detailed map here shows the area of the main public buildings we have been talking about. If you look at the large red pin dropped on this map, just above and to the right, you will see a smaller blue pin with a white cross in it. This is the location of St. Margaret's Church, which also plays a role in Mrs. Dalloway. It's really right in the precincts of Westminster Abbey, but a much smaller church. The park at the top is St. James's again. If you follow the street labeled Horse Guards Parade, you will end up in Whitehall. As you could see in the map on the previous page, the Parliament buildings are really a series of connected buildings, including the ancient Palace of Westminster. This image shows the relative positions of Big Ben, Westminster Abbey, and St. Margaret's. This is a central area of London, so lots of traffic, lots of tourists, lots of people attending to the work that goes on in all these official edifices. St. Margaret's Church is a very old church with a newer bell tower. The blue disc you see is St. Margaret's clock, which chimes just behind Big Ben throughout the book. When Virginia Woolf began writing the novel, she called it the hours. Clocks and time are very important in Mrs. Dalloway. Woolf focalizes the narrative through multiple consciousnesses, and so to keep readers grounded, she has clocks chiming to let us know what time it is, and also to show simultaneity. That is, the chiming of the clocks are a way to let readers know how events in the novel relate to one another in time. Just to show you how close these buildings are to one another, I stood on the street corner across from St. Margaret's and took this picture. Then, without moving my feet, I turned to my left and took this one. The tower on the extreme left is the Big Ben Clock Tower, now named the Elizabeth Tower after the late Queen. St. James's Park is a public park in the richest part of London. At lunchtime, it's full of office workers getting a bit of fresh air, and on summer weekends, the grounds are covered in city residents lying on the grass or picnicking. At the time of the novel, and still today, you can expect to see nannies and nursemaids pushing babies in prams, as well as people enjoying a bit of nature in the city. I was last in London during the centenary of World War I, and there were public art projects all over London as part of the commemoration efforts. This exhibit in St. James's Park is part of that. The exhibit featured current-day photographs of World War I battle sites. In many cases, you can still see the trench lines in farmers' fields. This canal is where Wilfred Owen died 1 week before the armistice. His platoon was tasked with crossing the canal while under heavy enemy fire. The photos at the bottom are, of course, Owen and Sassoon, and the poem printed there is Sassoon's Sick Leave. Bond Street, where Clarissa goes to buy flowers, is a major shopping street just on the edge of Westminster. Before Mrs. Dalloway was a novel, it was a short story called Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street. In the story, Clarissa goes out to buy some gloves and gets into a conversation with the shopkeeper about how the quality of gloves is not the same now as before the war. The story very roughly corresponds to what happens in the first couple of pages of the novel, so Woolf obviously added a great deal to her original idea. But just as in the short story, Woolf is exploring what it means to say the war was over. The Serpentine is a lake in Hyde Park. I'm afraid I have to give a spoiler or trigger warning now. Septimus, the shell-shocked soldier character in the novel, kills himself near the end. Clarissa, in attempting to understand his act, thinks that she had once thrown a shilling in the Serpentine, but never anything more. Woolf is on record saying that Septimus and Clarissa are doubles. When she began drafting the novel, there was no character like Septimus. Instead, Clarissa displayed the symptoms of mental illness we now see in Septimus, and Clarissa killed herself at the end of the novel. In the summer of 1922, while Woolf was drafting the novel, the British government held a series of public hearings on shell shock, which were covered in all the newspapers. Woolf followed that coverage avidly. Basically, 4 years after the war ended, there were still a lot of soldiers wandering around with symptoms of shell shock. Their trauma hadn't disappeared just because the war did. There was a public outcry for the government to do something for these men. The government, of course, was busy paying off the huge debt it had accumulated during the war, and it didn't want to be responsible for anything else. The shell shock hearings were an attempt to simultaneously give the public what it demanded, while getting the government off the hook. If you have the Norton Critical Edition of Mrs. Dalloway, there is an excerpt from their final report in the back, or you can find the whole report online. Basically, the government concluded that the war probably had something to do with soldiers suffering from shell shock, but that it really only affected weak men, those whose family had a history of drunkenness or mental illness, or who were abnormal in some other way. This neatly let the government off the hook for payments to large numbers of suffering veterans, while still assuring the public that the government heard them. Woolf recognized what Elaine Showalter later saw in the essay you read on shell shock, that hysteria and war neurosis were the same condition. In the novel, Sir William Bradshaw, the hotshot Harley Street nerve doctor, recommends an old-fashioned hysteria treatment for Septimus's shell shock. 6 weeks in the country, in a darkened room, drinking milk, in isolation, not thinking about the war. Remember Rivers, in his lecture on treating shell shock, found this treatment to be actively harmful to shell shock patients. So, in 1922, as a result of the government hearings, Woolf created Septimus, giving him the symptoms of hysteria that Clarissa had had in earlier drafts. I don't seem to have a good picture of Buckingham Palace for my own camera roll, so enjoy this out-of-focus stock picture instead. The large round park area in the foreground is encircled by a road that the mystery car at the beginning of the book would have used to get into the palace. That large white stone and gold monstrosity in front of the palace is a statue of Queen Victoria as Empress of India. She's seated with the emblems of her power in her hands. Peter Walsh is the haunting presence of British imperialism in Mrs. Dalloway. After Clarissa marries Richard, Peter runs off to India, which is standard practice for boys of good family who had to make their own way in the world. He marries a woman he meets on the boat. India was also where families sent their unmarried daughters because there were so many boys of good family there making their way. Immediately before the action of the novel begins, Peter has become involved with a very young woman, mother of 2 small children, and essentially the wife of his boss. So Peter has returned to England to seek a divorce so he can complete the act of wanton stupidity he is engaged in. It's important when we think about Peter not to be too caught up in his attractiveness. Clarissa keeps thinking how much fun it would be to be married to him. But also, she rejected him in favor of Richard when she was young, and even within the novel, every time she thinks that it would be fun to be with Peter, her next thought is, I couldn't stand it. It's useful to think about why and how Peter is fun. Suffice it to say, he is the sort of person who is not happy unless there's substantial drama going on around him. I agree with Clarissa on this one. Being married to Peter would be exhausting because it would involve so much cleaning up after his harebrained acts. We've moved the map a bit to show the top of St. James's Park and Whitehall, marked with the large red pin. Whitehall is a street where the buildings housing all the departments that make up the British government are. Newer departments are often housed in new buildings elsewhere because there's only so much room on Whitehall. Look at the lake in St. James's Park. Just to the right of its top, you'll see 10 Downing Street, the British Prime Minister's residence and office. Move your eyes down and a bit further right, and you will see the cenotaph. Because this street is the location of Britain's political power, it is guarded ceremonially, here by one of the lifeguards in full ceremonial attire and mounted on a horse. This image, from the Victorian era, shows families enjoying a walk in Whitehall, either on their way to or from the park. You can see the same guards in the same uniforms as in the modern picture. The cenotaph is a memorial to the dead of the Great War. A cenotaph is just a gravestone without a grave. This large stone monument was originally constructed in white-painted wood for an observance of the first anniversary of the armistice that ended the war. Designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens, it was so popular that it was constructed in stone for the 1920 Armistice Day observance. The image you see here is covered in wreaths and surrounded by poppies, the symbol of remembrance for the war in the UK and Commonwealth countries. When I saw it in 2014, it had only a couple of wreaths on it, but this lets us see the structure of the monument. It is simple and relatively unadorned, which is unlike many war memorials that have been erected in the past. Previous war memorials had primarily focused on exalting the glory and honor of the nation. This memorial says, "To the glorious dead," near the top, but it otherwise eschews pomp and circumstance. It's worth thinking about this memorial in the context of Mrs. Dalloway's take on the lingering effects and long-term costs of the war. Is Septimus one of the glorious dead? How about that nice boy that Mrs. Dalloway's friend can't stop crying over?